good to see everyone here this morning. We have several visitors. We have several folks back home from traveling and being out and about. It's just encouraging. Appreciate y'all being here. I feel it's just I'm obligated to make a quick explanation and apology. I kind of met my match yesterday. I went out and my wife helping me. There was a tree about to fall on the bus barn out there, dead in a hammer. And we got out there and I took an electric chainsaw, because that's about the only kind I can get started well. And we cut down a good portion of that dead tree to keep it from falling on the bus barn. And about all midway through it, got it all cut and laying on the parking lot, I died. The heat was too much. I met a limitation again, and I knew who I am. And so I kind of quit. So I apologize for the pile of brush. I will get the pile of brush off the parking lot. I trust it's not in anyone's way. But as is said in the Bible, the spirit was willing, but the flesh was weak. And certainly I am discovering more and more meaning to that. I can appreciate the fact that we just can't do what we used to do, and they're just natural limitations. And so we just got to get real with the limitations and enjoy the new you. The church is a very unique organization, and I want to talk this morning about the church and why it's kind of different from every other organization we've heard tell, especially when it comes to managing finances, that the church is not a business, and that is correct in every sense of the word. Of course, businesses have a different way of running than a volunteer, nonprofit kind of organization. When you've got volunteers, it's a bit different than a business, wherein you're trying to make a profit, and those that are associated with it have been hired for that purpose. So therefore, if you don't fill your role as an individual in that business of helping the company or the owners of the company turn a profit, there is a likelihood you'll get fired. And so the business is a little bit different than the church in that regard, and it's especially the case with the military. And there's a few of us in here who have some experience with the military, because in the military, you may have volunteered to go in the military. I did. I was not drafted. I volunteered to go in the military. But let me tell you, the volunteer ended when I said, yes, sir, I do, and checked my name off. From then on, there wasn't no volunteer to it. When the CO said, you're going to do this, you did that, because, a nice stay in the hotel called the Brig was not pleasant. A captain's mast where you lose your stripes and your paycheck was not pleasant. And so therefore you were compelled to do what you were told to do, and it just didn't really matter whether you liked it or not. If you wanted to get your britches in a twist because you didn't like what the CO said, go ahead and do that, but you better do what he said. Church is very different. It's a volunteer organization, and one of the struggles leadership always has with churches usually comes with that following God's Word. As a matter of fact, there is a great deal of time spent in the New Testament discussing discipline and how discipline is done in the church. One of the weaknesses we have, I believe, in the churches of Christ in this day and age is people don't know their Bible. And because they don't know their Bible, they're not familiar with what discipline is to be had and how we discipline and what the purpose of discipline is. And so it's a very different organization when you're dealing with volunteers, because very often it is the fact that you can't be voluntold. You really have to volunteer. And then when somebody volunteers, they only do what they volunteer to do. And so to begin with, and I think Paul may have been hitting on that when he talked to the Corinthians in his second epistle about contribution, contributing to a work of the Lord, to spread the gospel and to enhance the borders of the kingdom. And I know there are some here that are saying, oh, there he goes again, he's talking about money, like I'm patting my own pocket with the money. Not the case. No, quite contrary to that. In fact, I'll just share with you a little personal opinion here. I've always thought, preachers ought to be paid like people who have to work for a living. If you know what I mean. I mean, particularly in the way that, the church has a standing. If the church grows spiritually and if the church grows numerically, it ought to be reflected in the salary. If they don't, that ought to be reflected in the salary too. I guarantee you, and I'm a preacher, so I can say this, I don't have a great deal of respect for my profession. A lot of preachers are entitled. They're more than welcome to have all the names and the acclamation and the fame of being a preacher without doing much. And I resent that. I grew up with a father who decided that if you're going to be something like a preacher, you need to work for a living. You need to do the job. You need to get out and hustle. And I've spent lots of time in 1 and 2 Timothy and in Titus learning what my job is as a preacher. But the fact remains, having a willing mind when it comes to our monetary contribution to the Lord's work still depends upon our being willing to give toward that end. And that's kind of a sketchy thing. It's very hard to plan on some of those kinds of things. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of people that are so thankful that we are no longer living under the Old Testament law, where the tithe was given. You know, the tithe was very much expected from those who would even pretend to be faithful in the Old Testament. Pharisees would go out of their way to cut anise and cumin and minimum in half and divide it up in a tenth and be sure exactly that much went. Of course, they left off the weightier matters, but you could see that it was very important for them to give a tithe. Okay? Now, I'm going to hurt your feelings now. I just want to warn you ahead of time. But Jesus made the statement that our righteousness, Matthew 5:20, our righteousness ought to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. Now, I'm not saying that God demands a tenth from you. Oh, no. I believe He demands much more. Okay? I know that's a tough concept, especially in our economy, because our economy is horrible, I know. And, of course, I also understand, too, that on various occasions, I can't speak for you, but my wants and my needs sometimes kind of run together. I don't know how that works for you, but I have a couple of hobbies that get me in trouble frequently. And I love spending on a hobby that I think is really neat. Do I need to do that? Well, no. But you know what? When we start thinking about how well, with this willing mind that we're supposed to have, that Paul speaks of in the Corinthian letter, are we supporting God's work? It's not going to matter in my hobby when I kick the bucket whether or not that hobby was a successful hobby or not. What is going to matter when I stand before the judgment seat of Christ is whether or not my righteousness exceeded the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees all the way down to this matter. Macedonia is used as a great example, and right there in the same context that we were reading from just a moment ago that we looked at, Brother Parker read. Notice in chapter 8 of 2 Corinthians, Macedonians were given as an example of how we ought to give, how our contributions ought to be. And he talks about it. He said, "Moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia. God has blessed them," he said, "that in a great trial of affliction." Now, that's something we're struggling with, because here in Hamilton, we don't get a lot of affliction here in the church. Okay, so I know it'll be a stretch for us, but we need to imagine what it would be like if here in the church here at Park Heights, we had folks here in town coming over and giving us a hard time because we're worshiping. Giving us a hard time because we are investing our time and our monetary funds to support a work that goes on here. That's what they were dealing with in Macedonia. Then in great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. Here is an example of a measurement you could use to say this is how we ought to give. Now I'm about to get real personal here in just a minute. Looking at verse 3, "For I bear witness that according to their ability." Okay, here's one of the first standards we can use to determine how much we should give. Okay? What's your ability? Now, I have to confess, I am poor with money. It's nice, in fact, God understands that completely. It's why He's kept me poor most of my life. Bless her heart, Kelly's had to deal with that. But I don't handle money. I know some folk that handle money very well. And they're very well off because of it. And by the way, Joseph of Arimathea was very rich. There's no condemnation of Joseph of Arimathea. A lot of people talk about, you misusing the phrase Jesus used, where it's hard for a rich man to go to heaven, easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, so it's a bad thing to be rich, don't love money. No, that's not what it says. It says the love of money is the root of all evil. It doesn't say that money is. Joseph of Arimathea was the reason Jesus had a place to lay his body. Okay, you can use what you have, but that's what it talks about here. These people may have been in poverty, and it says deep poverty, but they abounded in the riches of their liberality. That doesn't give an amount there. You notice that? Because if I got $10, $9 is way liberal. Do you remember the example Jesus gave as they're sitting outside the temple and people are coming in and dropping their change into that's the way they used to take it in the old times, in the Jewish tradition. They had a pot right outside the temple where they went in to worship, and as they came in, they dropped their money in that receptacle, and very often that receptacle was a metal or brass thing. And so you could, like the Pharisees, raise your hand very high and drop your coins in there. So they would jingle and jangle and make all kinds of noise. Everybody know, ooh, he gave a bunch. Remember the illustration Jesus used of the lady, the widow with 2 mites? That's a little tiny bit of money. Who gave all that she had? Now there's what you're talking about in deep poverty, giving liberally. I like the fact that God did not confine us to 1/10, and that's what we're supposed to give, because there would be those Pharisee mindsets today who would sit there and divide. They're kind of like the IRS guy coming over and doing a deal with your finances and wanting to know every detail so they can figure out exactly how much taxes we're going to take from you. That's not how God does it these days. He leaves it up to our cognizance, our ability, our willingness of mind to look at a need and see that the gospel needs to be spread. And so these guys did a wonderful job. And it says here, I bear record their ability. Yes, beyond their ability, they were freely willing. You know, one of the reasons churches grow is because people are willing. It's not a matter so much of the skill sets people have or how rich people are. 9 times out of 10, or most of the time, I would say a higher percentage than that, it's because people want something to happen. If we want to grow here at Park Heights, the concept of giving of our means is just a minor detail in the big picture. In fact, he goes on and says that imploring us with much urgency that we receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering of the saints, and that's just another facet of our giving. We give because when we give, we are involved in others' successes in the gospel. And I'm just going to make a plug right quick here because this is a side chasing a rabbit out in the back. Bear with me. You know, when this church, this congregation here supports preaching students, do you realize that the contribution that we give to the work here at Park Heights, that by the elder's hand is sent to a young man who is learning to preach the gospel? When that guy converts somebody, you are a part of the success of that soul going to heaven. And just FYI, you know, we're supporting John Paul. He's going to come down and do our summer youth series here before too long. But do you realize John Paul is still in his first year of school and he's already converted 3 people? And thanks to this congregation, he has been able to study and better himself. You and I share in the conversion of a soul who will someday stand before the judgment seat and hear, well done, good and faithful servant, and will credit that to a bunch of people here that said, you know, this boy's got skills. We ought to support him. We have a fellowship in that kind of a ministry. There's an effective way in which you and I, who maybe we don't have the skill set, maybe we're getting old and can't drag brush real well anymore, and we can't do as much as we used to do, but by the same token, we can see somebody who has the skill and support them. Paul would never have been the success as a missionary had it not been for people supporting him, and he was even supporting himself. Folks, we are involved in a great work when we contribute to the work of the Lord. But here's the key, and this is the personal thing. In verse 5, not only as we had hoped, because Paul was having an expectation of this bunch of Christians. It's not wrong to expect mature Christians to be able to support good works. Okay? Not only as we hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord, then to us by the will of God. And he's talking about the finances they gave later. First, that's an interesting numeric quantity that is used on several occasions when it comes to the Lord's work. I mean, it starts back in Matthew 6:33, where Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount says, seek ye first the kingdom of heaven. There is a priority in seeking the kingdom of heaven over everything else. When it comes to the work of the church, here's the first. They first gave of themselves. I get tickled when people get a little tight when you start preaching, gets up, starts talking about money. Talking about money again. Yep, there he goes. Folks, money's just a tool. Okay? God wants your soul. By the way, you got nothing He needs. Nothing. What He wants us to do is to love Him enough to want to see His church succeed and go forward and see souls for which Christ, His Son, died to save. Hear the gospel truth and be saved. And so, yeah, it's an important work that we do. Of course, it's all volunteer, and I understand how difficult it is sometimes to convince people that their wants and their needs are not quite the priority, and very much differentiated when it comes to what we give. Well, really, when it comes down to it, if we give first of ourselves, then when you get over to verse 12 and you start talking about being first of a willing mind, when it comes to this contribution that he's talking about in this context, it's not really a problem. It's not a source of grief for anyone when they are giving because they love God's work and they want to see it flourish and they want to see it excel, and so that's something they want to be involved in. And what better use could you use of this mammon of this earth, this monetary transfer of funds? What better use could you use it for than somebody going to heaven and saying, thank you because you spent on me, you invested in me. Folks, we're investing in the church here, trying to get to this community. The things that we do as the eldership guides us and where we're going with the funds of this congregation to try to do things. I can't tell you how grateful I am and how pleased I am that I have had multiple comments on my articles. And I'm not that good, but I write one every now and then, and I turn a phrase on occasion that's pretty neat, and I have people call me and tell me, boy, that article really got to me. That article was good. That article made a difference in my life. You supported that. By your giving, the elders saw fit to put that article in the paper, and you are supporting that. You're a part of that. It's a win for all of us. Not just me. I'm just a cog in the machine doing what I try to do the best I can do. Just like yourself. You see, if you got that willing mind, the money thing is not the issue. It's not about the money. What it's about is having a willing mind to want to see the church grow. Now, of course, that volunteer organization is quite different. There is no imposition like our government who will come in with a tax man and sit down and work over your finances, and they'll take what they think they ought to be deserved of, and they'll take it from you. It's not like that kind of an organization. This is something where we have to be of a willing mind, and it's totally upon ourselves as to what we feel is justified, what we feel is it works, what we feel God will be pleased with. And that's one little thing I want to disenfranchise immediately. You are not giving to the preacher. Let me make that clear. If you don't believe that, ask the elders. They'll tell you real quick. You're not giving to the preacher. Actually, frankly, you're not giving just to this church when you give. You're giving to God. I've seen people extort from the church until they get their way. I'm not going to give unless they do things the way I want to do them. Brethren, that is not a Christian attitude. Shame on you if that's the way you think about your contribution. You're giving to the Lord. Now, granted this, it is going into a group of men who are in charge of leading and directing this church, this congregation. They will be tapping your opinion and your thoughts on things on occasion, and you are free to talk to them about what you think we ought to be doing with the finances in this congregation. But we all submit to our elders because we're all on the same page, and we want to see the church here at Archives grow. And so there's where the wisdom of our contributions need to be put into effect. We need to grow here. But it starts with a willing mind. And, you know, I don't know whether you think of it very much, but I just want to stop and tell you, God is listening to each one of you right now. I know your mind is going. Mine always does when I'm listening to a speech. I'm thinking, what did he say? Why did he say that? How did that mean? What's the definition of that term? I mean, Lloyd just used one a while ago. I'm still struggling on what exquisite, wasn't that what you call my best? Exquisite, yeah. And I'm going, what's that mean? I got to look that up. My mind's always going, okay? God knows what you're thinking right now. in the New Testament, and I still think this is a marvelous thing. You know, when Jesus is talking to a bunch of guys that dropped a fella down through the roof because he was crippled, couldn't walk, and he drops him down through the roof, and Jesus looks at that and says, "Ooh, that's lots of faith there, bringing that fella to me. Your sins are forgiven you." And the guys around him, the audience, there's some of them in the audience going, "Well, that's blasphemy. Only God can forgive sin." Now, they didn't say it. They just thought it. And Jesus goes, "Why are you thinking that kind of thing in your heart?" Now, the first thing I'm thinking of is, wow, he read my mind. Now, I can't speak for you, but I'm so glad you can't read my mind. I'm glad I can't read your mind. There's no telling what you're thinking right now while I'm talking to you. I'm glad I can't read your mind. You can't read mine, but Jesus can. He knows if you've got a willing mind. He does. I mean, I don't. But I'm telling you what God said. And he reads your mind. It happened multiple times. Even when the disciples, his own disciples, were in a boat and they're going across the sea, and he goes, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees." He just fed 4,000 and 5,000 consecutively, and he says, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees." And they go, "Oh no, we forgot to bring bread." What? Jesus is apoplectic. He's beside himself. What are you guys thinking? I just fed all these people with a couple of fishes and a couple of loaves of bread, and you're going, we didn't bring bread? No. And he had to explain to them exactly what he meant. Folks, he knew they were thinking that. They didn't say it. He just knew they were thinking that. And talking among themselves about it. Jesus knows what you're thinking. God knows what you're thinking right now. He knows whether or not you are invested in this congregation here at Park Heights. And for those of you that are visitors, appreciate y'all being here so much. But this little point is for the membership here. You have an obligation to God to see to it that you are an active part of the body of Christ in this place. Now, that's not just about the money. It's about everything you do in order to promote the idea that we want people to go to heaven. Part of it is the money. And part of it, that money part, needs to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. We know how the Pharisees gave. We know what they gave. We know the amount. We know what their attitude was. In all regards, we ought to exceed that. And the way we're looking at the Macedonians here in chapter 8 of 2 Corinthians, evidently in deep poverty, they were able to give and demanded Paul take it. Evidently, Paul understood their plight. And he was more than willing to look at them and go, "Boy, you guys are hurting, man. This is way too much." I don't know whether you've ever experienced that. I have on multiple occasions. When somebody is just over generous, they give you way more than what you know you're worth. And all you can say is thank you, and it just seems so anemic because it's so little compared to the blessing they have bestowed on you. I think of Paul as he's on the road to Damascus and discovers Paul on the wrong side. I think that motivated Paul, because there's no way you can pay back Jesus for taking a guy that hated the church and was killing Christians, and you take a guy and you turn it completely around. How do you say thank you enough for that? Why, you don't. There's your definition of grace in action. But I believe that motivated Paul to do everything possible to see the kingdom grow. When it really comes down to it, money's minor, but when you don't have a willing mind, it's terribly ungrateful. To say you love Christ, but you won't get involved with the church, you won't work with the church, you won't contribute to the things the church is funding so that people can go to heaven. And Jesus knows your mind. He knows what you're thinking. You know, I understand from Hebrews 11, 26 through 31 that we don't have to worry about things like they used to be. You know, Numbers 16 tells the account of a guy named Korah that decided he would challenge the authority and he would make new rules and do his own thing. And of course, it was an interesting conversation Moses has with the guy, but ultimately the ground opens up and swallows him alive, everything that he has, and just slows down. I am so glad today that God does not deal with us in the same way he dealt with those Israelites, because about the time somebody takes a jerk of an attitude about the church and what the funding of it and the things that are going on, the works that we try to do, and I'll tell you what, if the ground opened up to swallow them, it would solve our problem right quick. But I'm not sure how many of us would be here. And we might need to think seriously about who we are and how on board we are and whether or not we have a willing mind. You know, I'm getting out there as an older guy and I'm learning the flesh is weak. Spirit's willing. In fact, I get out and start cutting brush like I was back in my 30s. Now that I'm 68, 30s don't count. It just doesn't work anymore. I just kind of died. And there sits the brush on the parking lot. Spirit was willing. The flesh is weak. But you know, it's amazing what you can do if you want to. All I'm trying to do this morning is encourage you to have the want to. I realize that the text is about contribution, but it's so much larger under the big paradigm that we live as Christians. It's about us serving God and loving God and prioritizing God and seeking first the kingdom of heaven and giving first of ourselves and first having a willing mind. And the question you need to ask yourself, you have a willing mind? Because you know, that's a unique thing about church. It's a non-profit organization. Nobody's going to come in here and beat you over the head and tell you, you better get straight, we're going to beat you again. It doesn't work that way. And a volunteer organization, about what you can do is just invite people to make a right decision. And so Jesus would say, come unto me, all ye who labor under heavy labor, I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. So as Revelation 22 talks about toward the end of the chapter, the bride and the Spirit say, come. We are the bride and the Holy Spirit involved in the worship that we have as we congregate together and serve God, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. The Spirit and the bride say, come. We invite you to have a willing mind this morning. If you've got any issue you need to take care of, please let us know as we stand together.